Hello there and welcome back to Bullets for Bucks. Today we're going to be going over the Remington 700 versus the Tikka T3X. I'm sure the vast majority of you are familiar with the Remington 700. However, the Tikka is a little bit newer to the US market, but many of you probably still have heard of them. So let's get started and take a look at the pros and cons of each rifle. Alright, to get things started, let's first take a look at the Tikka T3X. Now mine happens to be the Tikka T3X Superlite, but everything is the same as the regular Tikka T3X except for the profile of the barrel and that it's fluted. I did rattle can camo this rifle, but just ignore the hideous paint job as I did that for hunting purposes. Let's go ahead and make sure it's safe and secure and unloaded. Okay, it is. I'll put that back on safe and put it right down here. The next rifle we'll be taking a look at is the Remington 700. Now this happens to be the Remington 700 long range version that comes with a 26-inch heavy barrel and a beefier fiberglass stock with an aluminum bedding block. However, the workings of this rifle are the same as every other Remington 700 and the action is the same. We'll go ahead and make sure this one's safe and secure and put that one on safe. Of course, one thing to note is that the Remington 700 comes in several different models. In fact, many different models. So, is this exactly apples to apples comparison between these two guns that I have as examples? No. But we can still get the main points across and take an in-depth look at both. The Remington 700 versions that are in the same price category as a Tikka T3X are probably the model ADL or the model SPS. Okay, so those are not this model. This model would MSRP for several hundred more than the Tikka T3X. Alright, so first let's just start by taking a look at how smooth the actions are compared to each other when the bolt is run. The Remington 700 has a very smooth bolt action. It rides very smooth up and down the receiver and locks firmly and securely in place. We will note that the bolt throw is probably about 90 degrees, so it's pretty significant on the bolt throw, but not too bad. Let's go over to the Tikka T3X and run its bolt. Oh man. The Tikka is definitely noticeably smoother and more refined feeling when it's run through the receiver. It's just like glass. We'll slide this one back and forth so you can kind of see. Also, one thing to note is the bolt throw is less than the Remington, so it has a shorter bolt throw. Both advantages over the Remington. But just to show how smooth the bolt is on a Remington 700, you can see there's a little more hesitation there, and I may in some cases have to jiggle the rifle to get it to float back and forth. So I would say the bolt riding in the receiver, or the smoothness of the bolt, is better in the Tikka T3X. Also, the bolt throw in the Tikka T3X is slightly better than the Remington 700. However, bolt throw doesn't matter a whole lot to me. It really matters to those guys who are trying to make really quick follow-up shots, possibly in a competition or something along those lines. It can be helpful in having a short bolt throw also, though, when mounting a scope, so that you have more clearance between your bolt handle and the scope itself, which sometimes can make it a little bit more comfortable when operating the bolt with a bulky scope. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the safeties. Remington has a two-stage safety. Safe, the bolt can still be operated, but the trigger cannot be suppressed and the gun cannot be fired. Forward, the bolt can still be operated, of course, and the gun can be fired. Now let's take a look at the Tikka T3X. Put it on safe. Okay, the bolt locks in place. Putting the Tikka on safe locks the bolt in place. Taking it off, first you can work the bolt and fire. Okay. I like having a bolt that locks in place when the gun is unsafe. So, both guns have a two-stage safety, we'll call it, but one, the Tikka T3X, locks the bolt in place when it's unsafe. I prefer this. Having hunted extensively out west, I've had my bolt in the Remington, in fact that Remington 700, get caught on brush and open up and become out of battery so that it could not be fired if I needed to fire it quickly. Also, I have heard reports that Remington bolts have even fallen out because they've become open or people have lost their ammunition. Now we'll go back to the Remington 700 and take a look at the trigger. Now most Remington 700s come with the X Mark Pro adjustable trigger. This one has the X Mark Pro adjustable trigger in it. So let's take a look. We've already made sure the gun is safe, and let's suppress the trigger. Okay, on this X Mark Pro there is no perceivable creep, only a very marginal amount of over travel. So that in itself is good. However, it's quite heavy. I would have to say that's about a 4-pound trigger pull. Now I have adjusted this trigger down to its lowest factory setting already. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Tikka trigger now. Both are single stage triggers. We've already made sure this is safe. Wow, that's a nice trigger. Okay, definitely breaks noticeably lighter than the Remington 700. Both have been adjusted to their lowest factory specs, by the way. Let's try that one more time. Okay. There's no perceivable creep. It breaks a little bit cleaner and crisper than the Remington, and has just slightly less over travel, but that's very marginal. They're very close in the amounts of over travel they have. Also, having used these rifles extensively, I can tell you that it is 100 times easier to change out the trigger or adjust the trigger on the Tikka T3X than on the Remington 700. Changing out the trigger with an aftermarket trigger or adjusting the trigger is so much harder on a Remington. Also, on the Remington 700, mine did not adjust according to factory specs. It's supposed to adjust between a certain pound range, and it just didn't. So even though they say it's adjustable, sometimes they just don't adjust the way they're supposed to. Now let's talk about the stocks that are offered from both companies. So Tikka comes with a polymer fiber reinforced stock that's quite stiff for being polymer. And it comes with a detachable box magazine that is polymer and single stack. It operates quite nicely, I can tell you from experience, and I haven't had any issues. It seems to be extremely reliable, especially since it is single stack. It does, however, have a plastic trigger guard, and everything is polymer. Now, like I said before, this Remington rifle is not in the same category as that model of Tikka, so let's talk about the Remington models that possibly are. You have the Remington ADL and the Remington SPS. The Remington ADL comes with a really flimsy, non-pillar bedded polymer stock that is horrible. It has what they call a blind magazine. You put the ammunition into it and there is no removing them. You have to work the action and they eject and fly through the air. That stock is horrible. Now the trigger guard, I do believe, is actual steel, but everything else is polymer, including the magazine itself with a metal follower spring. So I would say Tikka definitely has a much superior stock and magazine system compared to the Remington ADL. The next up would probably be the Remington SPS. I will say this, I feel like the polymer stock that comes on those is not as good as the Tikka. It is more flexible and doesn't seem to be as high quality. However, they do come with a metal floor plate, depending on the model you get, and a metal trigger guard. So in that regard, I would have to say that is slightly better in some cases than having the polymer trigger guard and polymer magazine. Alright, now let's look over some of the other features of each rifle. The Tikka's recoil lug is actually a separate piece of metal. It used to be aluminum and it would deform in some of the older models, the T3s. Now in the T3X they have upgraded it to steel, so it is more durable. It simply is a separate piece of metal that goes into a groove in the stock and then goes into a groove in the receiver. I do not like this type of recoil lug system, and I'm not really a fan of it. However, Tikkas are usually extremely accurate. Of course, on the Remington 700, the recoil lug is a piece of metal sandwiched between the receiver and the barrel, is firmly affixed in there, and is not a separate piece. It is quite beefy and good size, and it goes into a slot in the stock. I would have to say overall, I'm actually a bigger fan of the Remington 700's recoil lug system than on the Tikka. The Tikka T3X has a more streamlined, lighter receiver than on the Remington. It also has a nice side lever bolt release right here. On the Remington, you have a cheaper made receiver that isn't quite as trim and is a little heavier and bulkier. The bolt release is actually on the bottom in front of the trigger, and you have to suppress it. Because of the way this is designed, it makes it much more difficult to switch out the trigger, and in my opinion just isn't as nice as having the side lever release. Both rifles use a 2-lug bolt, so there's 2 lugs on each bolt. So in that way they're pretty similar. The extractor, however, is better on the Tikka than on the Remington and is much more durable. So in closing, I would have to say the trigger on the Tikka is better than the Remington. I would have to say the smoothness of the bolt is better on the Tikka than on the Remington. I would have to say the recoil lug design on the Remington is better than the Tikka, in my opinion, although many would probably argue otherwise. I would have to say the design of the receiver itself and the quality of the receiver itself is better on the Tikka than on the Remington. And I would have to say that the extractor and some parts of the bolt itself are better on the Tikka than on the Remington. In the price category we're talking about, I would have to say this Tikka has a much better stock, although the Remington has a metal trigger guard. The aftermarket support for Remington is of course still larger than Tikka. However, Tikka is growing every day, and I would have to say the aftermarket support for them is actually quite well and is growing exponentially. As far as accuracy, in my experience, and in the experience of many other reviews I have read, the Tikka is more accurate than the Remington. Also, in looking over many hundreds and hundreds of reviews, and in my experience, the quality control with Tikka is far superior than Remington. Also, the fit and finish of Tikka is better than Remington. Now, of course, Remington has a custom shop and they can produce really nice guns. There's no arguing that. But for the factory production models in lower price categories, I would say the Tikka is hands down a better rifle than the Remington 700. The finish on Remington is one of my biggest complaints, apart from the inconsistencies in production that lead to inaccurate rifles being produced. I would say the finish on the Remington is a Rustington. The finish on Remington gets a drop of water on it, and by morning it seems like rust has appeared. On Tikka, that is not the case. Remington seemed to have far more lemons in the batch than Tikka. If you liked this review, please go ahead and like and subscribe below. It helps the channel and it helps me be able to produce better content for you. Also drop us a comment, and I look forward to hearing back from you soon.